Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Taklai and today I'm joined by Tom Gardner. Tom Gardner, as most of you will know, with Ethiopia's The Economist's Horn of Africa correspondent. He moved to Ethiopia in 2016, although he had been covering Ethiopia starting from before. And he has a new book. Well, not quite new. It's been a couple of months since the book was published, titled "The Abiy Project: God, Power, and War in the New Ethiopia." So he joined me today to discuss some of the themes in the book. This is a conversation that we have been planning to have for a long time. For one reason or another, it hasn't quite happened until today. But I'm so happy that he is able to join me today. Thank you for coming on, Tom.
Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm so excited. So as I said, we're going to mainly focus on your book, Tom. And I think it would be good if we could set the context for our listeners in terms of your own journey in relation to Ethiopia. You say that you moved to Ethiopia in 2016. And essentially, the book is a chronicle of the main events that unfolded since 2016. So set the stage or the context for us in terms of your move to Ethiopia and what it was like for you.
Sure. Yeah. So I moved in October 2016. It was actually the very day of the Aricha festival that year, which tragically ended with the stampede and the start of what was called the Week of Rage, mass protests. So I arrived at a pretty dramatic time. It was a state of emergency as well a week later. So I was sort of thrust into the maelstrom, and I didn't quite. I don't think, part of writing this book was about kind of trying to make sense of what happened and also kind of account for my own misunderstandings or misapprehensions about Ethiopia and why things turned out differently to what I expected. I mean, to be kind of blunt about it, I came to Ethiopia. I'd studied a few years before. I'd finished a master's in African history and politics, and I was interested in Ethiopia a lot, but I had a particular set of assumptions and ideas about it. This idea of it as possessing the strongest state in the form of the party EPRDF party state, probably on the continent or of any big country on the continent. That distinctive history, but also the more recent history post 1991 of a government with seemingly more ambitions and kind of vision than many in other countries in the region, other governments in the region. So that's kind of what drew me to the place. I guess there was a certain kind of Ethiopian exceptionalism that I kind of, I guess, absorbed. But you did hear this in the academic literature a lot at the time, the idea of political settlement, the EPRDF's political settlement, the developmental state, all of this stuff was very interesting. People used to talk about, I remember reading articles before I came, comparing, Ethiopia to China in its early stages of industrialization, calling it the China of Africa or other kind of journalistic cliches. And that's what kind of brought me there, because I thought it was a country in the midst of a very exciting, epochal transformation and industrialization, rapid growth, it's a country or a government, EPRDF, and I guess Prosperity Party as well, which dealt in superlatives, the largest social housing program on the continent, largest social safety net, largest dam in Africa. All of that stuff was what, definitely caught my attention, and I thought I was coming to Ethiopia to write about development and industrial transformation, things like that. And the Oromo protests were very much underway, A lot of the discourse, I think, among analysts, diplomats, or whoever, was that this was a kind of maybe a blip, and that the EPRDF was strong, they would clamp down on protest, and the trajectory was, essentially upwards. So I was, I don't think I fully appreciated how significant the Oroma, and actually by that point it was Oromara protest movement was. But also, I think, looking back, I think these assumptions which were very, very widespread about the durability of the political settlement, the strength of the economy and economic growth, agricultural transformation, early stage industrialization. I think these were overstated. The state was clearly weaker. I mean, frankly, the fact that it unraveled so precipitously after 2017, and particularly after Abiy came to power, I think points to that. I mean, that's my argument, that it was clearly weaker than people realized. The EPRDF itself, as I write in the book, was clearly more vulnerable to capture, in the form, Abiy's sort of seizing control of the commanding heights of the EPRDF is a story of capture, which suggests, there was something, particularly post Meles in the EPRDF, which was much less sort of secure and than I think many people realize. So by the time after Abiy came to power, and we saw, and particularly after things started going really wrong, I was definitely grappling with the question of what went wrong and why. And quite early on, actually from about early 2020, had it in my mind, and also a publisher in mind for a book. Then the war happened, and things kind of went from there in directions that I don't think anyone had fully appreciated or predicted. So that's the story of where the book comes from. It's an attempt to make sense of what was happening, but also recognizing that I was, for various kind of almost just by chance, was there covering the country up close at this, what was very obvious to me, and I hope to other people, a few, clearly not enough other people, but the country was going through this like extraordinarily significant historical juncture, and that there was a role for someone, a journalist, kind of to write it up as a chronology of what happened, and the first draft of history is what I call it in the book.
Well, Tom, I mean, reading the book, one of the things that I was really struck by was the amount of detail and nuance that you managed to cram in the book. And I was telling you this before we hit the record button. And you say in the introduction in the book that you are the foreigner in Ethiopia, you had certain advantages in terms of having access to certain places and people, but also the fact that you are a foreigner and entirely dependent on translations and all that meant that there were certain impediments to your own reporting. But I'm generally, what was like for you? What were the vibes that you were getting in 2018 and 2019? I think Sarah Vaughan and Martin Plot also wrote about the tension in 2018 and 19 that you just briefly mentioned, and they say that to a lot of people, especially diplomats, it was obvious that war was coming. They knew that war was coming, and actually there was an element of wanting the war to, in their words, in their understanding, to crush the TPLF. Is that the sense that you got from the access that you were getting as a reporter, as a correspondent, having access to the places that you had?
I mean, there's a few different things there. In terms of diplomatic, particularly diplomatic, but also, of course, media as well, but embrace of Abiy and the so-called transition, democratic transition, I think there is a kind of knee-jerk tendency among Western diplomats to want to embrace what they see, or to project onto someone like Abiy, this kind of liberalizing visionary or reformer, and kind of cultivate him in that way. I think Michael Rayner, let's get very specific. Michael Rayner is US ambassador, was a huge had a huge part in this as the kind of most influential, powerful Western diplomat in the country at the time. And clearly, you know, he was at that time dealing with the Trump administration, had incentive, the Trump administration, which didn't, I think I put this in the book, I don't think had an active, particularly strong or active interest in what was happening in Ethiopia. So there was a certain degree of freelancing by a diplomat like himself to cultivate Abiy as he saw fit, and also to go to Washington and kind of present him as this hugely important pro-Western leader that that America and the West should embrace. And I think other embassies followed suit. And I think there was an analytical failing from the big start, in terms of failing to appreciate the scale of what was unfolding in terms of violence in much of the country, to wish it away, or to will it away as just a kind of a blip as Abiy was finding his feet, the sort of thing to be expected in any kind of messy transition to democracy. And I think that was the frame from 2018 to probably 2019, that these were temporary hiccups to be expected. And that's the way most of the diplomats I spoke to talked about it, but also clearly also seeing there was I think a willingness to take the government's account of what was the cause of what was going wrong at face value. This idea that there were deep state or Tigrayan TPLF actors who were sabotaging the administration at every turn. I think for sure that was accepted by the US, by the US embassy, no question about that. Don't want to overstate the consensus. There are different embassies, different diplomats, and different analysts with different, more nuanced takes on what was happening. But that was certainly the overriding thinking. And by the time you get to 2020, certainly there was people were concerned. I think, and frankly myself included, were not necessarily appreciative as early as we should have been. The fault line between Addis and Mekele, between the TPLF and Abiy, was as bad as, was such that it was going to lead to the kind of war it led to. And I think, I mean, obviously I did become cognizant of this. I think many embassies, many diplomats and the like continued to keep their heads in the sand. And then I would say that there were some, probably again, I'm afraid in the US side in particular, who once the war began went as far, went beyond just kind of negligence. You know, what I'm just describing there, I think, is primarily negligence and ignorance. I think there are some who went further and actively, or tacitly, supported the government once the war began, buying into this idea of a quick victory, of a short war. There was never much love for the TPLF among, I would say, the majority of kind of the Western international community, particularly by 2018, 2020. And just on a kind of a more systemic problem, I suppose, is that Westerners and diplomats and embassies and the like are very much confined to Addis Ababa, do rely on intelligence and analysts from a particular social milieu in Addis, do not travel. You know, should be clear. There are, honourable exceptions to all of this, but they do not travel much, do not speak to many different perspectives, and are thus very inclined to take the Addis view. And that I think actually transcends just this administration. I think that is across decades. You can see a preference, a kind of a structural preference or bias towards the, where the hole's the throne, as it were. And also not specific to Ethiopia, by the way. That's kind of more about how international relations works. But definitely, I think what happened 2018, 2020 is a bias towards the Addis view, which blinded people to what was happening, continues to probably today as well. And then once the war began, continued to shape responses in a way which I think was very damaging, particularly at the start of the war. I think there was a change in 2021 when the Biden administration came into office. There were certain individuals who were responsible for a shift, which didn't last that long. I think we're beyond that. We're beyond that particular period in US-Ethiopia relations, but that's a different question.
Well, I mean, you say, Tom, that a lot of diplomats based in Addis don't really travel to the faraway places in Ethiopia, and their view is limited to that extent. And I think that's a good point. But you say in the book, and actually you discussed that at length, during the supposedly honeymoon period of the Abiy premiership from 2018 to 2020, before the war, there were a lot of conflicts, especially in the southern part of the country. I think you discussed Guji at length. And actually diplomats based in Addis knew that they were happening, but that there was a desire to want to suppress those aspects of the Abiy regime. So there was an active desire to want to paint the Abiy premiership in a positive light, in a way that it wasn't. And I'm talking about the time when we were supposed to believe that everything was going smoothly during the Abiy mania time. But that has become a constant theme, actually, on the part of the international community, to want to suppress the negative aspects of the Abiy regime. And many people struggle to, at least the people that I speak to understand the reason, the rationale for that. Even now, there is a lot of conflict in the Amhara region. You know what happened in Tigray. And there is a desire to want to suppress those elements. And why do you think, as someone who is deeply ingrained in Ethiopia, who has access to those places, who has conversations with people, what are the things that you could tell us in terms of the rationale for wanting to suppress those aspects?
I mean, it is a tricky one, and I wouldn't say that is consistent across the board and across time, that outsiders or diplomats in particular have tried to suppress. I don't think that's always the case. I think that might be a little reductive, but I do think certainly before, let's start with before the pre-war period. I remember one very sharp and diplomat who was absolutely not, one of those I've just been criticizing. He described what he called egg on the face syndrome among, Western embassies, where they had built up this image of Abiy, invested a lot in the administration, had kind of come out and supported him so actively that there was a kind of collective reluctance to course correct, particularly among the likes of Rayner and those who were so out there kind of hailing Abiy as a visionary. They did not want to have to course correct. There's money involved as well. There's donor funds. There's a kind of institutional sloth as well that doesn't allow for that kind of shift. The gears are slow to move, and it requires a real consensus that actually we really got to change our position. I don't think that that consensus has ever been there to start with. I think now to the post-war period, I realize I'm not giving a kind of like over, you know, a kind of a grand theory here, because I don't necessarily have a grand theory or grand explanation, but I will point to, in the case of the post-war period, I think this desire to kind of paper over what is happening. I mean, there is certainly there are those who, you know, the kind of investor perspective, they want to kind of shine the image of Ethiopia from in order to kind of promote this the idea of images of Ethiopia as a place to do business and invest. Though I wouldn't overstate that, because the most of the investors that are actively involved in Ethiopia know full well how dangerous it is to be there right now, and as a result are not rushing to expand or invest. I would say there is an element of wanting to normalize, you know, in countries, you know, particularly the US, because these days, post Ukraine war, post Gaza, this whole the geopolitical context has all the kind of geopolitical dynamics which favor realpolitik and the kind of great power competition, motivations, I think are more salient than they were, than they've ever been, really. I think the US in particular has gone back to seeing Abiy as a flawed and difficult leader to deal with, but one who is ultimately indispensable because of the desire not to allow Ethiopia and the wider region to fall out of the kind of quote unquote Western orbit, to fall into China or Russia's sway, 20 more degree, which was obviously seemed to be the drift, the tendency during the Tigray war. They want to pull Ethiopia back, and I think there's no question about it. That is a top of mind, I think, for particularly US diplomats these days, and I think that a lot has been subordinated to that. And just on kind of the analytic failings of the diplomatic community, I do also think there remains this kind of lazy tendency to imagine that Abiy is, in a sense, indispensable, that any alternative, that they can't picture an alternative, that it's too hard to imagine an alternative. It is hard to imagine an alternative when he has centralized power to the degree that he has. But it becomes self-fulfilling, I think. And I think there is also just a tendency to think, well, we're stuck with him now. He is not anyone's idea. I don't think he's anyone's idea of a kind of ideal leader for Ethiopia, but because of certain pragmatic interests, certain geopolitical interests, a certain kind of lack of intellectual diplomatic imagination, I think there is a tendency to prefer the status quo, and that Abiy is now the status quo, and I think he will remain the status quo for quite some time. I don't see any reason in terms of externally for that to shift. I think the shifts will come internally, and then maybe the international community will adjust.
And of course, in this respect, Tom, you were an exception, which is why you were expelled from the country. We'll come to why that happened. And there's an interesting passage in your book where you describe a moment when officials from the Abiy office sent a request to the Economist for an interview, but they demanded that you not be included in the team. And I think that tells us that they knew you were not going to be favorable to them. But maybe you'll tell us more in detail why they thought that you wouldn't be. And actually, anybody who has been reading your dispatch for the Economist and your book would arrive at the conclusion that you were trying your best to tell what you thought were happening. So there is no denying that you were an exception in that respect. Now I have a couple of bones to pick with you later, but tell us what it entailed for you, for your own work in Ethiopia, because you tried to tell what you thought was the truth.
Well, on the question of why the Economist, as well as like the Financial Times and the Washington Post, were offered in interviews with Abiy in early 2019. The Financial Times did this big interview, which was fairly generous to Abiy. It included some quite startling quotes from the man himself, but it wasn't a hostile piece. The Prime Minister's office was very, very sensitive to anything that was even remotely critical, and they withdrew then the invitations for an interview to the Economist and the Washington Post, and there were no more interviews with any media except Ethiopian state media or maybe like Shega FM until the New Yorker in 2022. So I'm not particularly necessarily an exception in that respect. Like Abiy and the Prime Minister's office are not open to particularly critical or robust reporting. They have consistently expected or assumed that the foreign and local journalists would kind of just accept the narrative that they were putting out, which was that he was a beleaguered leader, kind of heroically taking on vested interests in the old guard and reforming Ethiopia and liberalizing Ethiopia, and they were not happy with reporting which suggested otherwise, including just reporting on the kind of the scale of the disorder in the country. I think where my relationship with the administration, which was, I would say from the beginning, there was never any, the Prime Minister's office had never been, despite sort of the image it likes to present, has never been particularly open towards journalists, foreign or local. Abiy's done one press conference since he became Prime Minister. I'm in Nairobi these days, and the idea of Abiy doing what William Ruto did, which was a Twitter Spaces kind of open discussion and taking questions from the public. I mean, it's just not the case. So I don't think I'm particularly exceptional in finding the Prime Minister's office and his aides pretty unwelcoming to journalists. They were much happier kind of presenting this kind of this image of Abiy, and kind of frankly kind of cultivating a cult of personality around him, and they would much prefer that journalists and others asking questions just stay away. But I would say that the big turning point, I guess, was for me with the Gedi conflict, when I wrote a piece in the Guardian. It was more of an op-ed piece, which was very harsh on Abiy, and was also basically made the point that that there was already at this point food aid was being denied and blocked and obstructed for political reasons. There was a kind of mass cover-up, well, not mass, a systemic cover-up coming from the very top to obscure what was happening, but worse than that, to prevent a humanitarian response to that particular crisis. And I wrote about that, and I was very harshly critical of Abiy, and particularly made the point that I think at that time that he wanted to cover this up because he was already at this point had his eye on the Nobel Prize. And I think after that, I always felt that, you know, I was not really, from that point on, it was very clear that I was not going to be favored. And I think that was already by that point. I think that came after they'd already, maybe I can't remember whether that was before or after they invited my editors at The Economist to interview Abiy, but very specifically said I was not welcome. But anyway, it was around that time. So I think by that point I was already conscious of the fact that it was not a warm relationship, but that's fine. I don't think the relationship between the press and the government should be a warm one anyway. That's not really the purpose. And then it just got worse and worse, obviously, because the country just got worse and worse. Yeah, I think it was, I kind of expected to be expelled at some point, particularly once the war began. And then once the war began, I wasn't allowed to, so I'd gone to Wolaga and done a kind of like, I guess was the only reporting from the ground on Wolaga by foreign journalists. And unfortunately, it's been too dangerous for anyone really to go there since. But you know, I thought that was a piece. You know, I think the headline was Abiy's Secret War in the West or something. I don't think that was received very favorably. Yeah, I mean, I was always sort of expecting to be expelled. Actually, you know, to be totally fair, the fact that I wasn't until the point that I was is to the credit of the media authority for continuing to grant me to renew my accreditation until eventually the order came from up top, from on high, to stop doing that. But I wasn't allowed as well into Tigray after the war began, because I was just there before it broke out, about 3 days before. And then when I came back to Addis, and I was sort of interrogated a bit when I came back. And then after that, you know, there was this kind of really infuriating period in 2021 when they did briefly open up Tigray under pressure, actually, from I think particularly from the US, to allow journalists in. They started to open the doors a bit, and you had CNN came, New York Times came. They all went up north to Tigray, and then me and one of my colleagues from Le Monde were stuck sitting in Addis. And I remember getting my letter requesting permission to go and report from Tigray. I remember going to the media authority and seeing the letter covered in red ink, like I'd, you know, failed a kind of exam paper at school or something. We weren't allowed to go, and that became very frustrating. So it always seemed to me from that point on that it was a kind of question of when, not if, that I would be asked to leave.
Well, in terms of being harsh on Abiy, one problem that I want to discuss with you, Tom, here is if there is a tendency on the part of foreign correspondents in Ethiopia and diplomats in general to be oversensitive about not wanting to be seen as taking sides, and to want to reach for descriptions and words that are value neutral. So, for instance, throughout the book, he used descriptions like to describe Abiy. You use words like controversial or enigmatic, or those sorts of words that are on balance value neutral. So reading the book, for instance, if we removed the references you make to the war and to the number of people killed, you wouldn't think you are talking about someone who has overseen the killing of millions of people from the descriptions that you use. And I wonder if that comes from wanting to be seen as neutral, as not taking sides. And I wonder if that is a problem that you consciously think about. Also, there is a passage where you describe, for instance, Abiy's interview with OBN, I think before he became the prime minister, and you described the interview as strange. And that interview that you're talking about is one where it's completely scripted. It's a drama where there's a machine reading sort of rattling of questions, and he's lifting of, I think, Henry Kissinger and all that. But there's a tendency to be generous generally towards Abiy. I don't know if I'm quite if I'm being unfair. Feel free to tell me if I'm being unfair.
I did not set out to write a polemic. Yeah. I don't think that would have been the right approach for me to do so. As I said, I wanted to write. I thought there was the purpose of the book was to write something which would, and it's not going to be the definitive account or the authoritative account, but a first draft of history. Yes, I would say I probably do towards being as sort of detached rather than kind of impassioned in my argumentation as possible, because I think that's, ultimately, if people are going to take it seriously as a work, as an account of this period written by an outsider, that my judgment was that was the best approach to take. And I think the evidence I marshal, I think anyone who reads the book and will reach the conclusions that obviously I share with regards to Abiy as a leader and as a figure. I find it. I can give you an example. There were, I had exchanges with, kind of editors and academics who read the early drafts, which were filled with some occasionally more emotive terms or adjectives. Some of those were actually removed by lawyers because, genocidal was removed. There was the feedback I got was that, that I should stick to a kind of more consistently detached voice, and that it's more ultimately has more impact and will have more impact, because I want to, and I believe, approach this as kind of fair-mindedly and kind of scrupulously with regards to kind of evidence as fact as possible, because that's where I think I can add some value. There will be other books written by other people which will be more impassioned, more polemical, maybe more will take a different approach. And I think that will, I'm not saying that doesn't have value, I do think that has value as well. Where I felt, because of my particular line of work and my position in the country, position as an outsider writing about Ethiopia, my judgment was that the more restrained, the better, and you let the facts speak for themselves, marshal and the evidence, the documentation, and that's where you can provide some value. So yes, I'm well aware that some people find it too restrained or whatever. I don't think it's generous in the sense that I go out of my way to protect or defend Abiy in any sense. I am careful when it comes to making claims which are not supported, in my view, by sufficient evidence, because I don't think that I'm undermining the value of my work if I do that.
That is fair enough, Tom. And you raised your eyebrows when I was asking you. Probably you thought that I was being unfair.
I just find I don't think you can come to the conclusion of the book, having read the whole way through, and feel it is generous to Abiy.
No, absolutely not. You're right. And actually, everybody I spoke with about the book is complimentary, and you have written a wonderful account of what happened the past 8 years. And I don't have anything negative to say about the book. I was thoroughly impressed.
Absolutely fair enough to make those kind of criticisms.
I was just trying to make. I was maybe a bit clumsy, but I was trying to make a wider point, which is that if there is a tendency on the part of foreign correspondents, and not just foreign, actually, any correspondent based in Addis, to want to pull their punch to avoid being seen in a certain light. You don't want to be seen as partisan, even though you're not partisan. You want to avoid that, and sometimes you don't quite get the right measure of how to avoid that. I was just wondering if that is a problem that you
No, I think it
recognize.
is a problem. I don't think necessarily that is specific to Ethiopia either, right? Like you have these controversies in reporting anywhere in the world with regards to the use of certain like terms and language, and where you know, when the desire to seem impartial leads to a certain kind of lack of moral clarity, and then vice versa, and you know, pursuing the pursuit of moral clarity leading to kind of partisanship. That's the kind of alternative risk, I think. It's something that is really hard. That's a balance that's just really hard to strike. And you know, often journalists are also just criticized for the pursuit of balance. I wouldn't say that I am, or pursuit of a kind of like false balance or false equivalence. I don't think that's what I did. And if people, maybe people will disagree. My approach was not to say, this is, this is a kind of a balanced, even-handed account. You know, I'm not going to make any kind of judgments or criticism. I think I am judicious. I think I make judgments, which are strong, but I also have, I don't think you should, I don't think it is good to, as a journalist, to reach strong conclusions, and I do think the book has strong conclusions, if you're not at the same time being meticulous and scrupulous when it comes to evidence, but also fair-minded in the way you approach the subject and approach your interlocutors and your sources and your contacts. If you just come in with a particular perspective, then your conclusions are going to be deemed suspect. So if I think it was important, I think it's important to yes, will defend the attempts to kind of strive to be fair-minded and kind of open-minded, but I think you should also at the same time avoid just kind of refusing to take any positions. And I don't think I do that, but I do think you're right to say that some of the reporting, but again, I don't think it's specific to Ethiopia, but I do think, yeah, sometimes reporting in an attempt to seem kind of even-handed or open-minded or fair-minded, whichever term you choose, can lead to a kind of lazy false equivalence. And I think that did happen a bit, quite a bit. I think kind of once the war began, then the accusations, we to speak for foreign media here, not that everyone was writing the same, but the accusation became rather the opposite, mostly, that it was that we were not being we were not being even or fair to the government and at all, that we were being biased towards the Tigrayans or towards the TPLF. That was another accusation. Maybe some people overcorrected. I don't think actually I was one of those. Overcorrected in terms of trying to avoid seeming that way. I think I think there was a very clear picture to me when the war was raging, in terms of the balance of atrocities and culpability. And I stand by my reporting in that regard. But that is actually the criticism we were mostly getting, I think, from 2021, 2022, was that we were not being fair-handed enough.
If you're not 100% effusive towards Abiy, the regime tends to say that you're not being fair, because one of the assumptions he did that Abiy is a messiah, infallible, and if you don't echo those sentiments, you are seen in a negative light. So I think that the regime's accusations towards you or anybody else shouldn't be taken seriously because of that. But in terms of the book, I think it would be good actually if we could wave it to the camera if it's within reach, because I only have a digital copy.
Oh yeah, sure. I have.
Yeah. I'm going to put a link to the Amazon Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the Abiy Project. This is a wonderful book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I'm someone who, you know, I think that I follow Ethiopian politics and I fairly understand it. But reading the book was a whole lot education for even for me. And I think you have done a wonderful job in terms of taking a fair vantage point and presenting to the people to understand what has been happening in Ethiopia. And I strongly recommend people to read it. And I have been having a lot of conversations about the book with my friends, people in my circle, and people are unanimous in their opinion that you have done a wonderful job. So I'm not being in any way critical about the book, Tom. But the title of the book, The Abiy Project, and actually, I asked myself, so I have read this book now. What is Abiy's project? And I couldn't really answer that. What is the project? Well, because it seems to be a hodgepodge of things that he's trying to achieve. Is that your sense as well?
Yeah. So one of the questions which I have tried to grapple with, and I think in conversations with Ethiopian friends and those who read the book, including those who read it before publication, one of the contentions was, well, does Abiy have a vision, and does he, that's the question of what is the project? Does Abiy have a vision? And there are, I think this is going to be one of the questions that animates historians going forward as well. And looking back, who is Abiy? And this is my attempt to kind of present one particular interpretation of him, and there will be, I'm sure, plenty of disagreement around this, but I reached the conclusion, maybe the word project is too strong, vision is probably too strong, and I caveat it in the book. I say that's not to suggest he has a clear or coherent ideological program or a clear set of policies, because anyone who's followed him and his administration would question that. What I'm kind of gesturing towards is an idea that there is more content to him and his administration, which he is, absolutely the embodiment of. He personalized it in a way that I don't think any leader in Ethiopian history since Haile Selassie has. I think there is a set of, the phrase I would use is a kind of orientation towards the world. There is a consistency in that, and you can kind of see that through his speeches, which may be in terms of policies, riddled with incoherence and inconsistencies, but there is a certain consistency in the terms of the way he orientates himself towards the world, certain kind of underlying themes, which actually are there from really quite early on. Weirdly, one of them is Medema, which was, there's evidence of him talking about from back in INSA. But I mean, more specifically as well, this very kind of individualized analysis of and psychological analysis of Ethiopia's failings. The idea that mindset and self-help and individual striving is what will set Ethiopia on a path to prosperity. I think he's quite consistent in that. So that's one thing that I think is, in terms of a consistent line and something that distinguishes him, and I think that's one thing. In terms of what the project is, yeah, and I think you're right to say I'm pretty vague, because I think it is pretty vague. It is a kind of inchoate.
I don't think it is. I don't think it's because you are vague, though. I think it's a reflection of the inherent problem. So you described what Abiy is trying to do, and the picture that emerges is a confused set of priorities and a confused set of visions. But one aspect where I thought I had a bit of reservation was he seemed to have sort of leapt too heavily on God, on religion, whereas I would have thought that Abiy's sort of allegiance to God or religion is a bit more performative. And actually, a couple of times he made allusions that he was a Muslim, other times a Christian, and one would think that he's just playing around. Otherwise, there is nothing that comes from a deep sense of conviction. Whereas on the other side, you seem to believe that there is a religious drive.
I think it can be two things. I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think he could be both personally devout and also use religion instrumentally for political purposes. I think if you look through history, that is the story of so many religiously inspired messianic leaders. I think it's possible for him to use religion politically whilst also being personally devout. I can't pretend to see into this guy's soul, right? So whether he really believes what he espouses, we will never know. I think there is enough weight of evidence in terms of how he uses it, like his rhetoric, the performance, I suppose, of religion, but also the fact that it seems to take up quite a lot of his time of day, whether that's prayer sessions, whether that is conveying himself in messianic terms. I think there has been some interesting work by some academics of religion who kind of focused a lot on him. Jörg Haustein from Cambridge is a good one to look at. The role of religion. I mean, I do think it is pretty central, but I also understand anyone who's religious, genuinely religious, kind of asking the question, well, if he's so devout, why is he so seemingly unmoved by the level of bloodshed spilt in his name? But I guess one could say that about the Crusaders in the Middle Ages. If you believe you are sent by God, then any amount of bloodshed is potentially divinely ordained, right? So I think
they say that the death sacrifices, there is something good to emerge out of that. So they see that if you listen to them, sort of to the way they talk about death, they sort of tell people that they shouldn't be worried about the death and the destruction because there is a better dawn coming. So they seem to have a certain contrived
That's also
vision.
what I mean by religious. I don't know if I use in the book, but a kind of a religious epistemology, like a way of understanding the world. I think that is clearly quite distinctively religious. Whether it's specifically Pentecostal, I think that's one for religious scholars to debate. But I think it's interesting that you do say they, right? And I think that was another point I was going to make. Even if Abiy himself is simply cynical, the people around him are very. I don't think there's any question that they see themselves as, performing or doing God's work, and use that as a justification, probably to themselves, in order to justify in their own minds what's happening. And I remember having some very interesting conversation with, I won't name them, but someone who worked within the justice, on justice reforms, who then had conversations, having left kind of because they were so concerned about what was happening, then having a conversation with the people around the Attorney General or Justice Minister Gideon, and being really alarmed once the war began by the way they were very, very openly defending and articulating and making sense of what was happening and what they were doing, through reference to God and the divine mission. We're saving Ethiopia from disintegration, which is what God wants from us. And then once you start thinking like that, and I think this helps to some degree, must help explain Abiy's relationship to the kind of carnage that has unfolded in his wake. I mean, you could just say, well, he's a sociopath, and that's not for me to make a judgment either way. But one way to explain or understand why he is seemingly so unmoved is because he is so certain of the righteousness of what he is happening, what he is doing, then that's a way of shielding yourself, shielding your conscience from the implications of what is happening, and your own moral culpability is to see it in these kind of religious terms. So for me, it is a helpful frame of interpretation. But yeah, I think that's another thing. I'm really interested in what are going to be the big central debates about Abiy moving forward, and by historians. And I hope to, in a certain sense, I hope when I say I want the book to be a first draft of history, I hope in that sense it sets the kind of, helps to set the parameters of what become the core debates. And one of those would be, Abiy and religion. Is religion really the best way to understand him and his project? I argue, as I put it on the cover, that it is. Some will argue, no, it's not. And as I said in the preface to the book, I look forward to reading accounts which emphasize different elements, or even could totally argue against what I've concluded, because we're still early stages in these debates, right? This is Abiy came to power 6 years ago.
Well, Tom, you don't want to conclude either way, but for what it is worth, my own belief is that if religion is the basis on which things are justified, then anything could be justified. And I don't think religion is a solid foundation on which to build politics. But that's my own view. I'm not going to ask.
I agree with you as well. But I mean, it's the reality is, Ethiopian politics for centuries has had a religious foundation, and it's quite. And I think what's one of the other points I do make in the book, and another reason why God is in the title, is because 40 odd years, 50 years of inconsistent efforts to desacralize religion in Ethiopia, I don't think were ultimately not that successful, or only kind of surface level. And what happened when Abiy came to power, he did unleash this. He gave license again to the role of God in politics, whether or not he is personally actually as devout as he said he is. The political discourse in Ethiopia has become more openly religious, and religion has crept back into the public sphere as well, in a way. Not in a way that's kind of straightforwardly just a revival of the pre-1974 dispensation, because it's not straightforwardly orthodox now. And that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about the way Abiy uses religion, is he's also trying to present himself as someone who is ecumenical, someone who's open to and inclusive to other religions, and wants to be able to draw on the political and mobilizing power of the different religious institutions to his advantage. So that's one of the complicating things, but broadly speaking, religion is back hidden in Ethiopian politics. So that's another reason why I put it on the title.
I think your point about the economical is a good one, because the people around him of different religions, and it doesn't seem to have mattered. Some of them are Pentecostal, some of them Orthodox, some of them Muslims, and somehow he seems to have found a formula for them to tag along without any problem. So there's an element of that as well. But I think it's a dangerous thing, because you could kill 1 million people and still say that it is for good. There is something good that would emerge from that. But Tom, in terms of the other point you make in the introduction of the book, is that before, people used to be very happy to speak with you, to discuss politics with you, but now they seem to be running away from you, presumably because they think Abiy's hand is everywhere. And the lazy cliche that people reach for is that Ethiopia has become an Orwellian state. But maybe they are onto something when they say that?
I think I mean, I certainly think that there's some truth to that, in the sense that Abiy has sought to build a technologically sophisticated surveillance state, and he obviously comes out of INSA, and you know, he has a certain predilection for that kind of thing. But and I certainly get the sense from talking to people. I mean, you know, there was a certain point in probably 2020, 2021, where suddenly everyone on my phone switched from every Ethiopian on my phone, or everyone in Ethiopia switched from WhatsApp to Signal, which I don't know if the state has the capabilities to hack WhatsApp. But that was certainly a perception that and that, in a way, even if it's not true, it's Orwellian in the sense, it's Orwellian enough if everyone believes that the state can see into their. Someone told me, a friend mentioned to me the other, maybe a year ago, or a bit less, that when they went to Ethiopia, one of the jokes was that Abiy can see you naked, being that Abiy has eyes everywhere. Again, probably useful for him, probably useful for Abiy to think that people think that, even if it's not technically the case. But it's Orwellian, yeah, for that, to use that cliche, if at least, even if it's not true, just to the sense that the state is watching. But what I would say in terms of just caveating is, and this is something that I think is a bit of a contradiction, which is kind of quite hard to explain, to convey as well to editors or to outsiders, is you have, in a sense, a strong state in some respects, but also barely a state at all in other respects. I mean, the state in vast swathes of the country has collapsed at the local level. That's been the case since in much of Oromia, since 2018 even. But you know, now it's also spread to Amhara. The state is weakening in Tigray as well. I can't speak for, you know, all of the South. I think the South is unfortunately an area of a limitation of my book, as I don't do much on the South. Somali region is probably different as well. I don't think the state has gone there, but you know, it's a state which doesn't have monopoly on violence, where you cannot leave the capital apparently now without being at risk of kidnapping. That is not a strong authoritarian state. That is a kind of state of almost kind of statelessness in some respects. I think Addis itself is this kind of bubble, as always, but in terms of where the state remains strong, its technological powers are most visible and present, and where I think the term Orwellian is most applicable. Possibly parts of Oromia as well, where, but it's also, then again, it's the state is kind of just a law unto itself, where you have, you know, all these like rogue, I don't know if rogue's the right term, but actors sort of carrying out covert assassinations of political leaders or individuals. Is it the state? Is it not the state? The whole that kind of blurriness is really, really kind of concerning. So I don't know if that's sort of Orwellian as well. This you don't know who's friend and who is foe. I think in parts of in much of Oromia, probably Amhara too. But in Oromia, it's been like that for a while, where the line between the state and then the non-state, the OLA or whatever, is really blurry. And I think that's another source of a lot of fear for people. Retaliation can come from anywhere. I mean, I think Orwellian does capture something. And I think, as I said, I think this line, Abiy can see you naked, really speaks to that.
Well, I hope he doesn't see this interview. Otherwise, I will be in trouble. But I could always say you enticed me into this conversation. But anyway, we have about 15 minutes, Tom. And if you could say a few things about the Tigray war and especially about the Pretoria Agreement and what it meant and all that. You say in the book, and this is something you implicitly say, not quite explicit. It's been a while since I wrote the book. Maybe I'm misrepresenting, but you say that the people who facilitated the agreement, the Americans and the others, were not really interested in pursuing justice in Tigray. What is the thinking there? Why is it that nobody seems to be interested in dispensing justice to the millions of victims in Tigray?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that stems from this idea, which many will say is flawed. I think is flawed. This idea that there is an inherent tension or contradiction between the demands of stability and peace and those of justice. They clearly pay lip service to the idea of justice and accountability, but I mean, right at this point, there was a point where actually it looked like maybe IMF or World Bank funding was going to be tied to, and they will say, well, actually there is a transitional justice process going on. That's what they'll say. But anyone who's looked at the matter for a second knows that's a joke. I think ultimately they did not make it contingent. It has gone ahead anyway. It turned out it was contingent on currency reform, obviously, not on like genuine transitional justice. So that ship has sailed, in my view. I think that is a great loss, because I think whether it's Ethiopia or in other contexts, but the cycle of violence, which I talk about in the book, and which I find really, I think is really important to pay attention to, can't be broken when you have just the kind of let us move on, pretend it never happened, and we know what that will lead. There's a generational damage, and a generation which will hold on to what happened. And they're not going to forgive and forget for without any effort being made to pursue the kind of justice and accountability and then reconciliation that's needed for that to happen. I mean, people are not just going to forgive and forget. I don't just mean Tigrayans. I mean anyone who's been a victim in this war the last 6 years. That's going to stay with them, and then these things return. Whether it will be a generation's time or maybe sooner. There has been no, and this is part of why the Pretoria Agreement is insufficient, or will not, because it's not been an attempt to grapple with the comprehensively with the causes and consequences of the conflicts in Ethiopia. It was the Pretoria Agreement, like, don't get me wrong, I think it was desperately needed. Like, I see it saved hundreds of thousands of lives at the time. It was we can't like dismiss that. And was there any other way to go about it? Like, I genuinely don't know. If you have a government or a figure in Abiy who was insistent that the talks happen on his terms, one of which is a bilateral agreement with the TPLF and to the exclusion of all other actors. That was the only option on the table. I understand, to be sympathetic to the American and other and African and whoever mediators involved, it was it was a very, very difficult set of circumstances they were dealing with to have achieved. I didn't predict a Pretoria Agreement, and I think 2 weeks before we were expecting the Eritrean army and the Ethiopian army to kind of blow through, attempt to recapture Mekelle, install a kind of puppet administration again, and the war would have continued. It didn't happen, and credit to, I think, to the Tigrayan leadership for compromising, and ultimately he hasn't delivered on it, but he hasn't delivered on these. But Abiy at the time did make some concessions. He talked to the diplomats in the room. He was the one on the phone from Addis on the phone. He made concessions over the question of Western Tigray in particular, and the sequencing of disarmament. Obviously, that has not actually happened. So, but it brought a reprieve at least, and brought about the ceasefire or cessation of hostilities. What it was not was a comprehensive political settlement. And what would have been needed, from the international community, would have been a degree of engagement and persistence, and persistently pushing both sides to actually implement. Leverage would need to have been properly on the table. That wasn't there. Frankly, and I say this in the epilogue, most of the international community now has treated Ethiopia as a problem solved. It slipped precipitously down the agenda. There was this weird, brief moment in 2021 where, for a variety of reasons, and I'm loath to credit Biden or Blinken because I don't think they deserve it, but Ethiopia was put quite high up on their list of kind of foreign policy crises to deal with, briefly. Once the Pretoria Agreement was struck, it just fell right down. And now with the war in Sudan, the international community or the West or whoever simply does not have the interest, desire, and capacity to deal with multiple horn crises at once. Apparently, that's not an excuse. That's not an excuse. That's a condemnation. But they don't, and there's a tendency to. They have, I think, on some level, outsourced kind of the region to the Gulf. That's a whole different question. I don't know if we have time to go into. Something I'm very interested in at the moment because I'm working a lot on the Sudan conflict. But I mean, just the level of disengagement. Mike Hammer's doing his best, and I have a lot of respect for him. But you need to have the weight of the leverage, the interest of senior leadership in DC above all, but elsewhere as well. Other powers, China does not seem interested in any way. Europeans are not seriously engaged. Britain, where I come from, is not taken seriously anyway. So there aren't many options, and they are not. I think, just to go back to where we started on the primacy of geopolitics now, it's, as you well know, it's Ukraine and Gaza at top, and there's a third. The international community basically can deal with apparently two major conflicts. Sudan is kind of talked of as a kind of footnote, despite what I'm trying now to help nudge it higher up, and it's starting to gain some traction, I think, but Ethiopia has just dropped totally down. And then you get nonsense headlines like from Paul Collier in the FT the other day, sort of saying investors are kind of, chomping at the bit to go back into Ethiopia because it's got this visionary reformist leadership who are sort of pursuing reforms whilst maintaining their policy autonomy, which is ridiculous. But the headlines are now totally different. I mean, I think they were. I don't think Abiy's government probably was particularly keen on the headline I had in The Economist the week of the IMF announcement, which was Ethiopia's in the grip of an epidemic, a kidnapping epidemic. But from my point of view, that's the headline story, which is that Ethiopia is lawless, and you can't. It's not a safe place for any of its citizens. So any of the discussions around foreign investment and economic reforms, I think, are just totally insufficient to the scale of all the realities of what is happening.
Yeah. Well, I think you have shed some very important light into some problems that are otherwise not discussed in Ethiopia. One of which is kidnapping, which seems to have become sort of very, very pervasive in Ethiopia. So that's thanks to you. But Tom, isn't it very strange and bizarre that the Americans should think Ethiopia is a problem solved now? Because, like you alluded to, the Western Tigray and Southern Tigray problems remain. People are still in IDP. The Tigrayans who had been hounded out of Western Tigray and Southern Tigray, they still continue to live in squalid conditions in IDP centers. The issue of justice you discussed hasn't been done. So the only thing, to the extent that they think that it's a problem solved, is just the active war has stopped in Tigray, but it's continuing
and the threat of disintegration, like
and the bigger problem
hasn't happened. So it's now seen as probably a containable, manageable problem. Of course, I'm not suggesting that none of the diplomats do not. If you ask them, would say, "Oh, Ethiopia is a land of milk and honey." Suddenly, I don't think they would say that. It's more the sense that the kind of their understanding of the scale of the problem is I think at the level of, well, it's no longer threatening to spill over into the wider region. I don't think that's true, but that's the way it's done. And also compare it to Sudan, this is not a problem of a comparable order. So that's what I mean by they're treating it as a problem solved. They're treating it as a problem solved in the sense they're not addressing it with any of the urgency that befits a problem of this scale.
But there seems to be a contradiction at the heart of this, because on the one hand they are pushing Ethiopia to liberalize the economy, and the agreement between IMF and Ethiopia is part of this push to liberalize. And actually, you discuss in the book that Francis Fukuyama had visited to Ethiopia, whom you paint as a godfather of this neoliberal reform. I don't know how much you want to say about that. We're running out of time. So there is that on the one hand, the push for Ethiopia to liberalize. But on the other hand, there is a deliberate attempt to ignore the poly-crisis. Actually, you say poly-crisis, crisis everywhere. So one wonders how they think the neoliberalism and the reform is going to work if Ethiopia is riddled with conflict. It's just something that doesn't quite work.
It's absolutely a contradiction. It doesn't make any sense. I don't think. I think it's a total failure of political analysis. It's a total failure of due diligence. There will be, I'm sure there are people who will argue, well, crisis serves the interests of powerful institutions like the IMF. I don't necessarily subscribe to that view, but I would be more inclined towards the kind of incompetence theory rather than the kind of conspiracy theory. But I certainly would agree that the level of engagement with the realities, I think it could easily exacerbate the problems rather than fix them if pursued without a kind of political process at the same time. I think this idea that there is the kind of, and you see this a lot, I think, with IMF thinking, but also some diplomatic thinking, there's a kind of economic bucket and there's a political bucket, and you have some diplomats who work on the political bucket and you have others who are working on economics, and it's like they don't think the two are intrinsically linked, and the one doesn't weigh on the other. And I think that's a structural problem in the way that these institutions will operate. They have different incentives as well. IMF might have incentives to get money out the door. The World Bank has incentives to get money out the door and have projects that they can, implement and all of that. And then, the political section have a different set of incentives, maybe in some of their cases, to maintain access to political leaders in Ethiopia. That also informs the way that they think and operate. But the bigger point being, there's no joined up thinking, in my view, around how to navigate these issues. I do have to go now, but I'd just say, just to conclude though, I realize we've talked a lot, for obvious understandable reasons, about the role of Western or the international community. I also do think important not to overstate the kind of power and agency of the international community. Has a huge role to play, but a lot of the, there's also, the roots of so much of this are domestic and local, and there are limits to what outsiders can do. They could definitely do a lot less harm, and that is something which I don't think is being heeded at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I know that you have a very tight schedule, and I'm so grateful that you managed to make time for us today. I hope you're going to come back on another time, because we have talked about Ethiopia for the whole day. So thank you very much. And please, those of you who haven't read the book, buy the book from Amazon. I'm going to put a link. If you could wave it one more time, Tom, because I have only the digital copy. The Abiy Project.
I should say it's coming out in the US next month, middle of next month. Like
wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and have a good day.
It was my pleasure.